Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I'm recording from Great Falls, Montana. I'm going to be speaking at the Montana Grain Growers Association conference here in just a couple of hours, but Rob and I sneaked in some time to record a podcast for you this morning, so we hope you enjoy. There have been a lot of recent ratings and reviews of the podcast recently. Really appreciate that. If you haven't done so already, that's a huge, massive help to us. Otherwise, you can reach me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have questions or comments about this podcast or about what we do over at CI. So, with enough ado for me, cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, it's happy Friday for the listeners, but happy Thursday to me and Rob. Rob, how's it going this week? It's been a busy one for both of us.
It has been really busy, but it's all good. The UNESCO made the baguette a World Heritage artifact today, which was pretty cool. I don't know if you saw Macron brandishing the baguette and talking about its merits for the world at his press conference, but that was pretty neat.
Wow, it took all of is that even a month or weeks for you to become a shill for French national interests around the world sitting there in Paris?
Well, I'm totally not fashionable because I think the fashionable French people don't like baguettes. They have other kinds of breads. And I'm a baguette lover. Like, I'm a noob. I'm a bread noob.
What other breads do they... what do you mean they don't like baguettes? What are they eating if they're not eating baguettes?
Oh, there's like 40,000 different options. There's ones with nuts, all different shapes, cereal ones. I mean, it's way beyond baguettes.
Okay, well, I'm not even going to go there. Well, yeah, I've been all over the place this week. I started the week in Madison, Wisconsin for a presentation to the professional dairy producers of Wisconsin. That was fun. By the way, shout out to Wisconsin. I love your state. It's great. I'm coming back all the time. It's like it's got everything you could want. Which is not to throw any shade at Montana, which is where I'm recording from right now. I'm speaking at the Montana Grain Growers Association later this evening in Great Falls. It's I believe it's 6 degrees outside right now and snow flurries. So I'm breaking out all my clothes from college that I haven't had a chance to use in over a decade, and some of them don't fit as well as they used to. And anyway, if we have any Great Falls listeners out there, don't worry. They're taking me to the sip and dip later this evening. I'll have to report back on the next podcast about what's going on there. But enough about what we're up to in the world. I feel like, Rob, you and I are both contrarians. And when we talk about something for a long time, my instinct is not to talk about it because we always want to find the new interesting thing. But that's not actually how media works in general. And if you're looking at headlines this week, we got to talk about China. So we're going to start there and then hopefully meander to some other places that are interesting to the listeners. But the week started off with, I don't think it's exaggeration to say these are the most serious protests in China since the Tiananmen Square protests. I think there are some very key differences, but I don't think it's a mistake necessarily to invoke the spirit of Tiananmen, and I do think it's a major threat for the Chinese Communist Party. The one thing that I'll say, and this maybe can get our conversation rolling, Rob, is the media narrative seems to think this is all about anti-COVID or protests against China's very restrictive COVID lockdowns. I think that's a part of it. I'm not going to dismiss that entirely, but there's this narrative that Chinese investments are not doing well right now because the economy is locked down, because she is worried too much about COVID. And once the COVID restrictions are lifted, the Chinese economy will start humming again. And you're seeing this rally in Chinese equities across the board this week. And I just don't think that that's right. I think that people are forgetting that the reason that Chinese stocks and Chinese companies came under pressure in the first place was not the COVID stuff, because China was, along with everybody else in the world, trying to control COVID at one point. They're just the last one standing. What really happened was the Chinese government started cracking down on Chinese tech companies, and the Chinese government started, there was concerns about the rule of law and concerns about restrictions if you're dealing with in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, or these semiconductor restrictions that have come up lately. And it doesn't seem to me, if you're just going to reopen the economy, that suddenly things are going to go great. But we'll just kind of start there. You and I have obviously been talking about the real estate crisis too. None of that is solved. China's growth numbers for the year and going forward look anemic. Xi is getting his wish for L-shaped economic growth. We're at the sort of flat line of the economic growth, and it's going to be a big test. So all of that comes together for some fairly consequential protests. But I say all that, and I still come away more optimistic than you, I think.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. And I feel like, I think it was Cato the Elder who, in all of the meetings of the Roman Senate, used to end every speech with, "And Carthage must be destroyed." Well, my version of that is every week you have to say, "And don't forget, the Chinese property bubble is by far the most important thing in the world," as much as we may want to talk about other things. Like, it's just so huge. So with that caveat and my Carthage, statement out of the way, let's talk about the other things, because I think there's really three issues that you laid out. There's the property issue, which we talked about. There's the sort of perceived governance issues, or sort of the U.S. investors waking up and realizing that China is not liberalizing in the way that some people thought, that there's going to be more intervention, that excess returns are going to be squeezed out of the private sector, all of those issues, which predated the most recent lockdowns, and then all of the other issues around COVID, stop-start lockdown issues, no one driving cars, oil demand plummeting, all of these things. So they're all moving in sort of different directions. And I wonder if you mentioned that there are similarities to Tiananmen, but also big differences. Could you enlighten us as to how you see that?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, Cato the Elder, Rob the Baguette Eater. Is that how we should brand you from now on? I think that sounds good.
It's a good way to be known in history.
You could definitely do worse. So for me, my top two sources on this are Bill Bishop and Jonathan Spence. So I read Cynicism, Bill Bishop's newsletter, all the time. It's great. And then Jonathan Spence's The Making of Modern China is, for me, like it's my Bible when it comes to China. It was the first real book I read about China, and it's sort of, it's a really nice look at modern Chinese history from really the collapse of the Ming Dynasty, and ends just around Tiananmen. So I say that to say I've been following what Bill Bishop has been saying very much, and I went back and I was rereading my Jonathan Spence when I was trying to get my mind around it. And I think the big difference is that the Tiananmen Square protest, it wasn't just, some of it was cathartic, and some of it was sort of a random outpouring of emotion that led to people in the streets. And there was a Chinese leader who died at the time that also had people kind of going out into the streets. But it was really a multi-year process. And it was a multi-year process where a generation of young Chinese people thought that the country was going to liberalize. So Mao was gone and Deng was in charge, and he was talking about both economic and political reforms. And I think a generation of Chinese students in particular felt like their country was going to be much different in the 1990s, that the liberalizing myth that we talk about in the United States, that they believed in in part in some of it, because that was part of what it meant to relax some of the Mao restrictions. And that happened over a period of years. There were series of protests and sort of clashes between the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and people who wanted more emphasis on democracy or human rights and these sorts of things. And it all comes to a head at Tiananmen. And Tiananmen is where Deng has to make a very difficult choice. He sort of sees the protests getting out of control, and I think basically in Deng's mind it was, well, I can't have political and economic reforms. I can maybe have one, which is more important. And he goes for the economic reforms, and he crushes the protests in general. So I think that's a difference in the sense that I don't think you have a generation of young Chinese people who are expecting to live in a more democratic China 5-10 years from now. Like, Xi Jinping has not been telegraphing a more democratic China. So there's not that sort of ideological upswell or ideological coherence to what's going on. I think it has a lot more to do with catharsis. I think it's a diverse range of protesters. It's in a diverse range of cities. And I think it has to go back to a lot of different things. I'm sure the Xi stuff is part of it for certain aspects of the protesters, but I think part of it is the COVID-19 lockdowns. Part of it is Chinese policies that are leading to lower economic growth than the Chinese people were expecting. Part of it is Xi clamping down on sort of wealthy Chinese people or business owners and talking about redistribution of wealth and things like that. The protests were sparked by a fire in an apartment building in Xinjiang province, where 10 people died because apparently the lockdown restrictions were too much for the authorities to actually get in and help. But that city in Xinjiang where the fire happened, it had been locked down for 110 days. Can you imagine an American city being locked down by the U.S. government for 110 days? So even the Chinese people have kind of limits to what they're going at too. So the similarity, I think, is that it still poses a significant challenge to the Chinese Communist Party. When you get people out in the streets, people publicly denounce, you can get social media videos of people publicly denouncing Xi Jinping. Like, that's a big deal. That doesn't happen so often in China. But the flip side of that is that it doesn't feel like there's a coherence to the protest. It feels like there's this just exhaustion with everything that the Chinese Communist Party has been doing. And I think Xi is sort of at that similar moment with Deng. He's going to have to make some hard decisions. And the first decision, it looks like, is we're going to pivot a little bit away from zero COVID. I don't think he wants to. I don't think this was planned even a month ago, as some people have been suggesting, but I don't know that he has a choice if the virus is going to sort of spin this much out of control and you're getting people in the streets saying, enough, we don't want to do this anymore. So that's where I'm at with the similarities and differences. I should also just say, like, the weird thing that happened this week too is, then Jiang Zemin dies during this week. So you get this weird, Tiananmen started because a former Chinese senior leader died. Now another Chinese senior leader dies, who's kind of a throwback to all of that era. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
I guess the only thing I would add to that is, I think traditionally when you've seen major disruptions that actually result in regime change or true revolutions, they tend to happen when sort of the future direction of the country is somewhat open to question, and that is telegraphed by those who are in power. So I think you're right. Like, the big difference between now and back then was there was a huge schism within the Chinese leadership about which direction they should go in. And Deng Xiaoping had a very specific, more economic, liberal direction he wanted to go in, but he had enormous enemies who were trying to undermine him. There was a lot of internal dissension, and that was very out in the open. So it's a very different environment now, as you point out. She has won. Like, he is the sole, big daddy standing on top of everything. And there's really not that same kind of existential question of which direction is the country going to go in. And there's no question that that's up for debate. So I think that's the right way to think about it, is it's sort of catharsis, expressing frustration about certain things. But it seems very unlikely from my standpoint that this is going to turn into anything, existential.
No, and the comparison I made in the Global Sitrep this week that's going out on Saturday is that, we do have to talk about Tiananmen, and there are some of these overtones, but it's really, you're right. It's not so much about what is happening in Chinese society. It's more about, this is an inflection point for Xi. And in that sense, for me, it's sort of his Mao late 1950s move. So Mao, authors The Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s. One of the big aspects of that is that China is supposed to become self-sufficient in grain. His bureaucrats are so scared of him that they are afraid to tell him that none of the quotas that Mao has been setting are being met. And Mao, believes the faulty data, and nobody's telling him differently. And what you get is famine that kills literally millions of Chinese people because Mao doubles down and he's not willing to see things different. Deng is sort of at that moment. He staked a lot of his reputation on zero COVID. It's not going to work. I think it's admirable how long China was able to contain the virus. If the entire world had that kind of discipline, maybe we would live in a different place, but there's no use crying over spilled milk. But now he can't control it anymore, especially in a globalized economy where the virus is becoming more contagious, all these other things. So he either has to let go and pivot and be open to change and, all the sort of weakness or uncertainty that comes with a leader pivoting on something like that, or he doubles down. And if he doubles down, it's kind of that Mao late 1950s moment. And that's really, I think, when Mao lost control. Like, everything that happens after the 1950s, the Cultural Revolution, like all that stuff is Mao just like really like, tight knuckles trying to keep his control over the system. So we have a real test here to see if Xi has enough flexibility and enough confidence in himself to make the pivot away. When the future of government or when the future of a country is up for grabs is really when revolution happens, which is why the situation in Iran in some ways is much more pressing to me than the protest situation in China. The economic stuff in China, I think, is actually sort of where the center of gravity of that issue is. Iran is a great example of a country where the future of that country is up for grabs, and it's not clear who comes after the supreme leader, and you have different factions that are both battling and now are out in the streets with each other. Like, that's the place I think that's what revolutionary protests kind of look like, but they can take all forms. But before we leave China, why don't we connect it back to what we've been seeing in markets as well? Because there's geopolitical reality and things that are happening on the ground, and then there's how the market is interpreting it, and the market has been interpreting China in ways that I find weird all year. So
yeah, and I think it's always good to have that pragmatic anchor to whatever we're doing. Is we're not just here giving our opinions. In the end, we're practitioners. We have to make a decision. So the setup on Chinese equities is that they have been in a downtrend since the last 18 months almost, and really reached heavily oversold levels about a month ago. And since then, in anticipation of COVID opening and a pivot on the policy there, have really rebounded sharply. And our analysis of the market action is that downtrend is still intact. So Mr. Market is not telling us yet that you're getting a durable bottoming process. You're getting a knee-jerk, positive reaction. But so far, I'm not seeing any evidence that this is ending. And the things that have been tipping China into a real horrid bear market have fundamentally changed, which are the property issues, the corporate governance concerns, all of that stuff. So if you're Xi Jinping and you're facing the difficult balancing act that you are facing right now, what do you think Mr. Market is telling us about what he's going to do, Jacob? Like, how do you connect the geopolitical fundamentals with Mr. Market's response?
Well, I think it backs the argument that I was making at the beginning, which is to say, I don't think that this is, or not that it has nothing to do with the zero COVID restrictions, but that's not the center of gravity. Like, that might be the issue that brought people out into the streets for this cathartic moment. But the reason I think Chinese equities have been in that bear market is for all the other reasons. We've got the property crisis. We've got the concerns about rule of law. We've got the trade war, which is kicked into another gear. None of that is going to be solved by a COVID-19 reopening pivot in China. And there's a flip side. We were just talking about this in our CI research meeting. The flip side of Xi's hand being forced and maybe having to pivot away from his zero COVID policy is the whole reason he has a zero COVID policy is because China has a shitty healthcare system, and he's worried about an older country with a lot of elders who could get sick, and a hospital system that can't handle being overrun by COVID-19. If you're going to pivot to sort of away from zero COVID, your healthcare system's going to get whacked. Vietnam is a great test case for this. This happened to Vietnam last summer. Vietnam got through it, but it was 6 to 8 weeks of hell in Vietnam and supply chain disruption all over the place. And China's has magnitudes more issues than Vietnam and doesn't have the type of Western support that Vietnam did in sort of getting over its problems. So I guess I think what Mr. Market is telling us is that you can have the zero COVID narrative all you want. That seems to be what's being on the headlines and what's in social media and what everybody's talking about. It's really not the most important thing with China. There's the economic problems China's facing. There's the what happens that people aren't expecting with the zero COVID pivot away. And then there's also, the question we were talking about before, is Xi actually going to make the pivot, or is he going to double down? And is that going to cause sort of problems of its own? So you put all of that together, things don't look good. One thing I would say on the geopolitical front, there has been a little bit of a softening in U.S.-China relations in the last couple of weeks. It started with that Biden-Xi meeting in Bali. There were some tariff exemptions from both sides, reciprocal tariff exemptions extended for another 3 to 6 months on both sides that happened this week. There was a White House official telling CNBC that the visit in Bali was very constructive and has set up future bilateral dialogue. So there is some, whispers of maybe we're back to where we were in June before the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan. Maybe the White House is thinking a little bit more about, can we soften this trade war, at least in the short term, to help the Fed with getting inflation down and sort of think about attacking the supply side a little bit more and getting China back into gear. That might be sort of a more optimistic reading if you're trying to understand what the market is trying to sniff out, that these semiconductor restrictions will be paused for a while, that the U.S. and China, now that Xi has passed the party Congress and Biden has passed the midterms, that they don't have to rail on each other so much for political purposes. That to me is a more compelling narrative than, oh, we're going away from zero COVID and suddenly China's going to go back to growing like gangbusters. Like that, I don't think is a realistic thing.
And I guess that's a nice segue into the interactions between China and Europe, because, speaking of coming in from the cold, I mean, there have been some big developments there just in the last week with the economy minister of the Netherlands making those statements today about the semiconductor issue. And did you want to just speak to those developments in case the listeners haven't been following as closely as us?
Sure. So, I mean, what we're really talking about here is actually for me, it's the U.S. relationship with the European Union. And, Trump's trade war, it was primarily targeted at China, but it wasn't just about China, if you remember. So he picked a lot of fights with the Europeans over trade. He called Canada a national security threat and threw some tariffs at Canada on that. I mean, the U.S. went after its allies too during the Trump administration as part of the general trade war. I bring that up because one of Biden's sort of top priorities when he came into office was to repair the transatlantic relationship. And one of the ways that manifested was the Boeing Airbus dispute, which had been ongoing for 17 years and which the Trump administration had been pushing on. It basically got resolved in the form of a truce. And the United States and the European Union seemed to be on the same side of a lot of different issues in a way that they weren't before. And the Russia-Ukraine war maybe offered the possibility that they would be on the same side again. That seems to be turning a little bit. So there's been a lot of reporting this week that European officials are really not happy with the Biden White House. They're not happy with this new industrial policy and this sort of, I mean, if you'll forgive it, but it really is make things in America greatly again, if I was trying to sum it up in terms of what Biden's industrial policy is. And the Europeans don't like that. They also don't like that the U.S. Is selling them more gas at higher prices. They don't like that the U.S. is getting to sell weapons into the Ukrainians and making money off of that. You've got Emmanuel Macron hanging out with Joe Biden. I believe their state dinner is today, or maybe it was last night. I'm not sure. But, France coming to bring some of those grievances to the United States and saying, hey, we don't like this. We need to sort of be more aligned. And the United States, saying all the right things, but then, Biden still continuing on with his industrial policy. So there is this break, I think, between the U.S. and the European Union, and it started in the Trump administration. It's continuing in the Biden administration just because in a truly multipolar world, like Europe and the United States can be on the same sides of lots of issues. But if it really is every man for himself, or every country for themselves, or every woman for themselves, like there are going to be divergences because what is good for the United States is not necessarily what's good for the European economy. And I think that has been out sort of in full swing. And the flip side of that is if you're a Germany or if you're another European country, that changes the way you think about China. That also maybe changes the way you think about Russia or some of these other countries long term. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz got killed for going to China and sort of doing the pragmatic thing and meeting with Xi Jinping. He got killed in his own government. People were criticizing him. But I think he also sees that, well, if the U.S. is going to go full, U.S. industrial policy and they're going to go full trade war against China, not necessarily the right thing for the German economy to sign on to that. Germany's made big bets about China. And just because of this Russia-Ukraine war doesn't mean that some of those companies need to abandon those bets. So I'm not, by the way, not supporting that view. I'm just trying to explain it. So that's I think the tensions that we're seeing there between the United States and the European Union, it's really important, and it's the evidence that I think that we really are moving towards that multipolar world as opposed to just a bipolar world with the United States and China on opposing sides.
And the issue around ASML and semiconductors and the Netherlands in particular seems like a pretty interesting test case where they were making comments this week basically saying, like, look, we're not going to cut China out entirely the way that you would like. And, there was some nuance around those comments. But still, it seems like a very surprising rebuff of the United States. I mean, we spoke about the Netherlands and Japan in particular being sort of the bellwethers here, and it looks like it's tilting toward confrontation rather than towing the line. Is that a fair way to sum it up?
Not for Japan. I think you're right for the Dutch. I mean, it's the United States led the charge towards globalization, and it seems to be leading the charge now away from globalization. So you can understand why a company like ASML, which is literally like ASML should be like the platonic example of what comparative advantage looks like, where one small country gets really, really good at this one really, really hard technical thing. Everybody depends on them. And it's the United States that says, okay, we want to use the creation of this incredible technology to hurt another country. Like that wasn't supposed to happen in the Washington Consensus and in a world with the World Trade Organization, all these other things. And so you can sort of feel why China's upset about it, why a company like ASML is upset about it, because if you're really sort of changing the macro fundamentals of the world trade right underneath them. But in terms of Japan, Nikkei actually had a survey out this week that had, I think it was 78% of Japanese companies that responded to the survey said there was increased risk in procuring parts and materials from China. You had more than half of them saying they were going to imminently reduce procurement ratios from China, and even more than that for certain components and things like that. So it seems to me that Japan is decoupling from China. And I think Japan understands that it has risks and exposures to China that it can't handle and that it's going to throw in its weight, not necessarily just with the United States, but that it's more a robust part of sort of opposing China. And that makes sense. Like China's right across, it's right there. It's a neighbor. It's a much less pressing threat for Amsterdam to sort of look at and be like, why are we worried about the Chinese? They have to get through Central Asia and Russia and all of Eastern Europe and Germany before they get to us. Like, are we really concerned that they're going to come marching over here? Like, probably not. That's not as much of a pressing concern, more for Japan. So and this also goes back to the United States is just not this unipolar power anymore. Even when the United States was a unipolar power, it's not like U.S. power meant that the United States could just go to a foreign company or a country and say, do this or else, and that company or country would just do it. That's a fairly what's the right word? It's a fairly heavy-handed way of trying to conduct foreign policy. If you really want to build a coalition against China, you need diplomacy. It has to be, okay, do this for us, and we will do this for you. We will make you whole in this way. This is why this will be good for you. The United States really isn't doing that. It's all about fear of China rather than here's the thing that we're building towards, because the thing that we're building towards is, and it's for both Biden and Trump, it's the thing that the U.S. is building towards is make America great again. There's no reason the Dutch should be cool with making America great again.
Well, it's interesting because we just completed our monthly review of all the different countries that we look at. And we look at the monthly charts, which are very long-term charts as a group with our CI investment team. And it was interesting to step back and look at the broader themes that emerged from that. And I think, somebody made a joke that in some ways we're kind of long the U.S. security alliance, because the most bullish charts that we're seeing include Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico. I don't know if you'd include Mexico in the U.S. security alliance, but they're certainly tied to the hip to the U.S. That was a little bit surprising, but I wonder if the market is starting to sniff out that the nations which are well positioned to at least be on a side are going to see investment growth beyond what one might have expected.
Yeah, although those countries also all share in common that they are not exposed to the Eurasian landmass. They have resources that they're probably going to be able to sell as supply chains rejigger and as people try and source things differently. So, for instance, I've made the investment case for Poland a couple of weeks ago in the Global Sitrep. I'm feeling very bullish about Poland. You said the chart for Poland didn't look very good. Poland is certainly in that U.S. security alliance. So it's not just about being in the security alliance. I think there's two profiles right now for the types of countries today that we're interested in. The first are the countries that are geopolitically strong enough to sort of chart their own course. So those are countries like Brazil, like Turkey. India is one that we could go back and forth about, but it has a lot of those elements where that's a large enough country where it can be self-sufficient in some ways. It can really be out there for itself and be one of those poles of power in a multipolar world. And then the other ones are you selling commodities that everybody is going to need? Are you far away from potential enemies? And are you going to have some pricing power as you become sort of the depot for the U.S. alliance or for the Chinese alliance or this, that, or the other thing? So I think that's how I would break it down. Certainly, though, and this is an argument I've been making on the road here in Wisconsin and Montana this week. A lot of times, especially whether it's American companies or American agricultural producers, one of the questions I get the most often is, well, what market should I be prioritizing if China's not the one? Where should I be exporting to in the future? And the sort of one of the controversial places that I land is your top export market might be the United States. Might just be right here, because where is GDP per capita going up, and where do you have the most secure supply lines, and where can you actually be sure that you're going to get return on those things? Like in this multipolar world, like looking a little bit closer to home might be the way to sort of express that in that way. So yeah, I think that's why just because we're moving towards this multipolar world, and just because the United States power relative to other countries is declining, doesn't mean the United States isn't still fabulously powerful, fabulously wealthy, and a great investment. If anything, the threats will probably spur the United States to new investment and will create destruction in some industries that depended too much on globalization, and also tremendous opportunities in industries that refocus themselves around these global dynamics that we're seeing. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, no. Where shall we go from here?
Well, I think the sort of last place to go for me, and there's sort of this is one of those weeks where there wasn't one big thing. I mean, I guess the Chinese protests were there, but there's just a lot of little things, and a lot of it's covered in the sit rep this week. But moving to kind of South America, there were two things that happened in South America in the last week that really caught my eye. The first was the developments on Venezuela. So Venezuelan political factions met in Mexico over last weekend, and they signed a deal to work together. And it looks like the Venezuelan opposition, which controls some of the Venezuelan government's frozen funds abroad, because countries like the United States recognize the opposition as the real leader of Venezuela, they're going to unfreeze some of those funds to help rebuild Venezuela's electric grid and invest in public health and some things like that. And then right after that, the U.S. said Chevron can go resume oil production in Venezuela 3 years after U.S. sanctions halted all those drilling activities. So I thought that was really interesting, because now you're starting to see the United States it's a very small step, but a step towards, hey, can we normalize relations a little bit with Venezuela? Which is something I've been thinking about for a long time, the United States thinking differently about Latin America, getting less ideological and more pragmatic. The second thing, and this may have gone under the radar in general, but Argentina and Brazil and Paraguay issued a pretty angry joint statement this week criticizing Uruguay, whose foreign minister is in Australia and New Zealand this week, trying to gain entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that's a big deal, because Uruguay and all those countries are part of Mercosur, and Uruguay has basically been doing whatever it wants from a trade perspective. It's negotiating a free trade agreement with China. Now it's running around talking about the TPP with Australia and New Zealand. And you've got these three other Latin American countries saying, like, hey, what gives? Like, you're supposed to be part of Mercosur. We either do this together or we don't do this. So the sort of slow decline of Mercosur is something I've been writing about and thinking about for a while. And I think it poses a real challenge and a real early test to the Lula government in Brazil, because Mercosur has not done what it was supposed to do. It didn't increase economic and trade integration within Latin America. In some ways, Mercosur really suffered from globalization, because all those countries just went and traded more with China. So do you try and keep Mercosur together? Do you try and bring Uruguay back in line? Is Brazil happy to let Uruguay be the fall guy for the ending of Mercosur, and they're going to think a little bit differently about how to think about, how to project Brazilian economic power and integration within South America in general going forward? Just two things that happened in South America this week that I think they will go largely under the radar, but which fit into this sort of general multipolar world that we're describing.
And if Mercosur essentially breaks down, what does that mean for Brazil as by far the largest economy, the largest country in the region? Does that, I would imagine that impacts them less severely than it would the smaller countries that are looking for access to Brazilian markets, looking for access to Brazilian commodities. Who gets hurt? And why is Uruguay, do you think, eager to, flirt with the TPP?
And with China. I mean, if you're a small country like Uruguay and you don't really have enemies around you, you don't want to be in any one block. You want to be in the free trade environment. That's what's good for a small country like that. You want to sell your things abroad. So it makes perfect sense that they want more free trade agreements abroad. And Brazil has also complained before that they haven't been able to go and negotiate trade agreements that they want in other parts of the world because they're stuck with Mercosur, because Argentina has completely diametrically opposed interests in terms of how they think about free trade and liberalizing in trade and things like that. But I think this goes back to the unintended consequences of globalization. Mercosur was founded around the same time of NAFTA, around the same time that China was welcomed into the WTO. And China coming into the WTO had a lot of different effects, but one of them was that instead of integration between those Mercosur countries, they all just started sending and selling their commodities to China. Brazil's doing that more and more. The Chinese are looking at Brazil now as a major alternative to things like U.S. corn and U.S. soybeans. So I think for Brazil, it's an interesting sort of test case, because they can either try and remake Mercosur in a way that allows them to have that integration and build more economies of scale within South America. That's sort of our bullish thesis on it. Or, they can go negotiate their own free trade deals and just be a provider of commodities for China or whoever else in the world, which is sort of a continuation of Brazil over previous decades, and I think would invalidate some of our optimism about Brazil going forward. So I think that's where it is. I think that these countries would still they're still going to trade with each other. There's still a lot of cross-border flows. Like, Mercosur is not going to go away. Like, I don't think it's that sort of thing where the trade agreement is going to collapse and suddenly Paraguay is going to collapse into ruin because all these trade things aren't happening across the board. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think it's an interesting look and an interesting decision point for how Brazil wants to frame itself in terms of trade relations, and whether it wants to be the leader of South America or whether it wants to be a provider of commodities to different powers abroad. And maybe it can have its cake and eat it too. I'm not sure. But if I was advising Brazil from just a geopolitical perspective, I would say this is a great opportunity to build up South America, to build up integration and build up the strength of neighbors, rather than just going and selling corn to the Chinese.
What about Brazil and Europe? Because I thought it was funny and interesting that after the election of Lula, one of the first calls that was made was by President Macron, saying, and this was a big thing here, where he referred to Lula using the familiar tu form, which is like, whoa.
Wow.
That's not very formal. I barely speak to my mother-in-law using the tu form, never mind the president of Brazil. And, basically saying, I've been waiting for this moment because now we can do a lot of business together. How would you think about the different incentives of the Lula administration and the ability of Brazil to project the kind of values that Europe seems to demand from an environmental standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, all of these things, in order to do business with the EU? Do you think that they can square those things, or is there something fundamentally preventing any administration in Brazil from meeting the kind of hurdles that you would need to meet to really become a strong partner for Europe?
Well, you might have a better answer to this than me, because you're the one who's running around Paris eating baguettes and triple cream brie. But if I were to venture an answer, it's a little weird, because it really goes down to how much do you buy why Macron was so anti the EU-Brazil free trade deal? Ostensibly, it was because Macron didn't like Bolsonaro and didn't like the destruction of the Amazon and all these things that Bolsonaro was doing that Macron found somehow personally offensive and projected it that way. But my understanding of it really was that the French government was more afraid of Brazilian competition in agricultural markets, and that French farmers and French food exporters were going to be hurt if you got this EU Brazil free trade deal, and that was why Macron kind of quashed it at the last second. I don't know why Macron would feel especially friendly towards Lula. I've said this before, like Bolsonaro is crazy and he's got his own thing. Lula's not exactly like the best person in the history of the world if you're Macron, from a Macron standpoint. This is a guy who went in Time magazine earlier this year and said that Ukraine was half responsible for the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, Macron is here in the White House or here in Washington, or is going to Washington this week to talk about how France and the United States need to be on the same page about resisting Russia. And France is supposed to be the one that is standing up to Putin in defense of democracy and things like that. So you're just going to hang out with Lula and say nice things about him, even though he's been on that position. So it would be a little strange to me if it really is all just personality driven. But it's also hard to argue with it. I mean, if he really is using the two for him, and you also see sort of the vitriol with which Macron went after Bolsonaro, it was actually somewhat uncharacteristic for him. I think of Macron as largely pragmatic, and he was not very pragmatic at all with Bolsonaro. He was quite happy to make an example of him and look down on him and really make fun of him. Supporting Lula's, if France wants better relations with Brazil in the long term, that's not the way to do it, because Lula may be in office, but he's in office just because of how crazy Bolsonaro was. It was obvious in the last election that the center right is where most of the votes went. Like in the Brazilian Congress, it's the center right that has control. It's not Lula's acolytes that were sort of winning the election in large terms there. So it's a bad bet, I think, there for Macron if that's the way he's thinking about it.
Well, it seems like it's on the environmental issues, it's a sort of easy win for him in some ways, because he's been tacking to the right on sort of identity issues, immigration, all of the key bugbears of the National Front, which is now called something else, but it doesn't matter. And don't underestimate how important the environmental issues are here. And specifically in Brazil, like there's a lot of discussion about the Amazon, about deforestation. I mean, this is a huge topic of conversation. It's huge in the media, in the newspapers. It's probably the most important issue for the left at this point, as far as the thing that they can all agree on. So I think there's probably a bit of a balancing act aspect to that. That said, it's hard to imagine that Brazil would be engaging in any kind of, free trade agreements without wanting to get access or preferential access for Brazilian agriculture. And that's another hugely sensitive subject, as you know. Now, there's been some weakening of that at the margin. So, for instance, the EU is now considering updating its legislation to consider different kinds of genetically altered foods, not GMOs, which is a different thing, but genetically altered foods, which is essentially changing the DNA of the food using like a CRISPR type technology. And that's surprisingly gotten some acceptance from some quarters. Of course, there's a big outcry in the places that you would expect, but they're kind of tiptoeing a little bit toward, hey, we need to be a little flexible in order to secure food and necessary commodities, but it's always going to go up against that historical motivating factor to always source locally, depend on European agriculture that adheres to higher standards and that sort of thing. And that's going to be a big stumbling block to get over, I think.
Yeah, although the European Union can't, I'm wondering if the European Union can't also, or can't have its cake and eat it too there, because the EU and EU countries are getting pretty draconian about how they're enforcing some of their environmental concerns, especially in relation to farmers. There was that report from the Netherlands this week about the Dutch government came out with a plan that basically said if not enough Dutch farmers sign up to sell their farms to the government, that there will be compulsory selling of Dutch farms. And yeah, we'll pay you 120% of whatever the value is, but that the Dutch government is going to come in and shut down some farms just so that they can meet their quotas on nitrogen pollution out to 2030. Netherlands, one of the biggest agricultural exporters in the world compared to its size. It's a major source of business there. And if you keep doing that across the European Union, if you keep curtailing the ability of farmers to actually produce things, well, first of all, a lot of people are going to leave farming and agriculture in general. And second of all, your output's going to start declining. So I wonder if we're going to get into a position here where Europe goes so far on the environmental concerns on its agricultural sector that maybe Europe does start looking at importing things from abroad that it wouldn't otherwise. There's a long way to go between now and then, but if you if Europe continues on its trajectory right now with how harshly it's cracking down on agriculture due to the environmental things, like, might be a different story 10 years from now, where France is not worried about Brazilian competition, but is worried about maybe getting access to some things from Brazil because they can't necessarily get it in Europe anymore because they've sacrificed, production in the name of the environmental gods. Anything else, Rob, before we close out here? It can be a short and sweet one this week.
Well, let's go short and sweet.
Okay. Listeners, we'll be back at you next Friday, and got a nice, I did an interview on the road here with Dan Bossi, which will come out on Monday, so enjoy that. And otherwise, I hope you all are warmer than me. I'm gonna go participate in the rest of this conference and try not to freeze my butt off. So. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.